Chapter 15, Casanova, Memoirs of Casanova, Chapter 15. I was in this state of anxiety and despair when two guards brought in my bed. They left immediately to bring the rest of my possessions, and then more than 2 hours went by before I saw anyone else. This delay, which was not natural, gave rise to all sorts of thoughts, but I could not fix my mind on anything. I knew only that I had everything to fear, and this certainty made me try to place my mind in a state of tranquility, capable of resisting all the disasters which threatened me. Besides the leads and the second quattro, the state inquisitors have 19 horrible underground cells in which they place prisoners whom they do not wish to execute, even though they consider that their crimes deserve death. All the judges of the earth have always thought that it shows great clemency to spare a criminal's life when his actions deserve death. But they often substitute for that momentary pain the most horrible kind of suffering, each moment of which is worse than death. These underground cells are known as the wells because there is always 2 feet of water on the floor. It comes in from the sea through the same grilled window which gives the prisoners a little light. Unless the poor wretch condemned to live in one of those impure cesspools wishes to take a bath in salt water, he is obliged to spend all his time on the wooden platform which supports his straw mattress. In the morning, he is given a jug of water, some thin soup, and a ration of bread, which he must eat immediately if he does not wish it to be devoured by the huge water rats which abound in those horrible cells. Prisoners who are placed in the wells are usually sentenced to spend the rest of their days there. During the 2 hours I sat waiting in my new cell, I could not fail to imagine that I was going to be put into one of those loathsome holes. I finally heard hurried footsteps, and soon Lorenzo appeared before me, foaming with rage and blaspheming God and all the saints. He began by ordering me to give him the axe and other tools I had used to cut through the floor, and to tell him the name of the guard who had given them to me. I answered calmly that I did not know what he was talking about. He and the guards searched my clothes, my mattress, and the cushions of my armchair, but they found nothing. "You won't tell me where the tools are now," said Lorenzo, "but there are ways to make you talk. If it's true I made a hole somewhere, I'll say it was you who gave me the tools and that I gave them back to you." At this threat, which brought a smile of approval to the lips of the guards, whom he had probably irritated by a few angry remarks, Lorenzo stamped his foot, clutched his hair, and stormed out of the cell like a madman. The guards left and came back with the rest of my personal effects. Before leaving the corridor, and after locking my cell, the windows through which I received a little air. I found myself confined in a narrow space without being able to receive the slightest breath of air from anywhere. I was only moderately upset by my situation, however, because it could have been much worse. It had fortunately not occurred to Lorenzo to turn my armchair upside down. I was therefore still in possession of my pike, and I believed that I could still regard it as the instrument which would sooner or later set me free. The next morning, Lorenzo brought me some abominable wine and undrinkable water. Everything else was of the same quality: dried out salad, foul smelling meat, and bread that was harder than an English biscuit. When I asked him to open the windows, he pretended not to hear me. Then a guard began to sound my entire cell with an iron bar. He tapped on the walls, the floor, and particularly under my bed. I watched all this with an impassive expression, but I observed that he did not tap on the ceiling. That's how I'll leave this hell, I said to myself. However, the success of my plan required circumstances that were not in my control, because I could do nothing that would not be seen. The cell was newly refinished, and the slightest scratch would have been instantly noticed. I spent a cruel day, for the heat was like that of an oven, and it was impossible for me to eat the food that had been brought to me. I was so weakened by hunger and excessive perspiration that I was unable to read. The next day my dinner was the same. The putrid odor of the veal which the scoundrel brought me made me recoil when I smelled it. "Have you been ordered to make me die of hunger and heat?" I asked. He locked my door and did not answer. The third day I received the same treatment. In despair, I resolved to take vengeance on Lorenzo the following day by plunging my pike into his throat. The night calmed me, however, and when he appeared the next day, I contented myself with telling him I would kill him as soon as I was set free. He only laughed at my threat and left without saying a word. Finally, on the 8th day, I angrily ordered him, in the presence of the guards, to give me an account of my money. He replied only that I would have it the following day. My anger subsided when he appeared the next day because, before showing me my account, he gave me a basket of lemons from Signor Bragadino, a large bottle of water which I judged to be good, and a very appetizing roast chicken. Furthermore, one of the guards opened the windows. When he gave me my account, I glanced over it and told him to give the remainder to his wife, except for a sequin which I ordered him to give to the guards. My generosity won them over completely, and they thanked me effusively. They left, and Lorenzo remained alone with me. You have already told me I was the one who gave you the tools to make that hole, he said. So I am no longer curious about it. I saw that his own interest obliged him not to say anything to his masters about what had happened. I ordered him to buy me the works of Maffei, Maffei. This expense displeased him, but he did not dare to say so. He asked me why I needed more books when I already had so many. I've read them all, I said, and I need new ones. I'll arrange to have one of the other prisoners lend you some books if you'll lend him some of yours. Then you can save your money. They may be novels, and I don't like them. They're scientific books. You're mistaken if you think you're the only intelligent man here. I'm willing to try it. Here's a book. I'll lend to your. Bring me back another. I gave him Petau's Rationarium. Petau, Rationarium. A few minutes later, he brought me the first volume of Wolf. Rather satisfied with this, I told him I would do without Maffei, which made him very happy. Less delighted with the prospect of reading that learned work than with the opportunity to carry on correspondence with someone who might help me in my plans for escape, I opened the book as soon as Lorenzo was gone, and my joy was great when I read on one of the pages a handwritten verse commentary on this line by Seneca. Calamitosus et animus futuri axios. Unhappy is he who worries about the future. I immediately composed another verse, and here is how I managed to write it down. I had let the nail of my little finger grow long in order to use it as an ear spoon. I sharpened it and used it as a pen. I had no ink, and my first thought was to prick myself and write with my own blood. But then it occurred to me that I had some mulberries and that their juice could serve as ink. Besides the verse, I wrote a list of my books and put it in the binding of the same book. In Italy, books are usually bound in parchment in such a way that the back forms a pocket when the book is opened. Beneath the title, I wrote the word La Tête, hidden. I was impatient to receive an answer, so when Lorenzo returned the next day, I told him I had read the book and that I would like to ask the person to send me another. I had a few moments later. I opened it as soon as I was alone. In it, I found a loose sheet of paper containing these words in Latin. There are 2 of us in this cell, and we are both glad to see that the ignorance of an avaricious jailer Avaricious, always have trouble pronouncing that word. Our vicious jailer has given us a privilege that is unprecedented in such a place. I am Marino Balbi, a Venetian nobleman and a monk. My companion is Count Andrea Aschino. He has instructed me to tell you that all his books, of which you will find a list in the binding of this one, are at your disposal. But we warn you that we must take every possible precaution to conceal our correspondence from Lorenzo. After reading the list of books, I wrote who I was and how I had been arrested, adding that I did not know for what crime I was being punished, and that I hoped to be set free before long. Balbi replied with a 16-page letter. Count Athino did not write to me. The monk told me the story of all his misfortunes. He had been in prison for 4 years because he had enjoyed the favors of 3 young girls by whom he had 3 children. The first time he received only a reprimand from his abbot, ABBOT. The second time he was threatened with punishment, and the third time he was imprisoned. The abbot of his monastery sent him his dinner every morning. He told me in his letter that he had been obliged to acknowledge his children publicly so that gossip would not attribute them to other men, which would have damaged the reputations of the 3 honest girls in whom he had fathered them, and that furthermore he had not been able to smother the voice of nature which spoke to him in favor of those innocent little creatures. He concluded with these words: "There is no danger that my habit will fail. There is no danger in which my abbot will fall into the same error, because his affection is active only toward his pupils. I was able to judge his character. He was eccentric, sensual, a bad reasoner, malicious, foolish, careless, and ungrateful. All this was clear from his letter. For example, after telling me he would be very unhappy without Count Athino, who was 60 years old and well supplied with books and money, he covered 2 pages with slander against him, describing all his faults and idiosyncrasies. In the outside world, I would not have replied to such a man, but in the Leads, I had to turn everything to profit. In the binding of the book, I found a pencil and some paper, which enabled me to write with ease. This is how I reasoned to myself: I want freedom at any price. My pike is excellent, but it's impossible for me to use it because every morning they examine my whole cell except for the ceiling. If I want to leave here, I'll have to go through the ceiling. But in order to do that, I'll need a hole, and I won't be able to make it from here because it will take more than a day. I need a helper, and he can escape with me. My choice was, of course, not difficult to make. It had to be the monk. He was 38 years old, and although he was not rich in common sense, I believed that his love of freedom would give him enough resolution to carry out the instructions I would give him. I would have to describe my plan to him and then find a way to get my pike to him. I began by asking him if he wanted to be free and if he was willing to risk everything to escape with me. He replied that he and his companion were ready to do anything to break their chains, but he had added that there was no point in racking our brains to invent unworkable plans. He filled 4 long pages with the impossibilities that presented themselves to his poor mind, for nowhere could he see the slightest chance of success. I replied that I had already devised a plan that would overcome all the difficulties, and I gave him my word of honor that I would lead him to freedom if he would agree to follow all my instructions to the letter. He gave me his promise. I told him I had a 20-inch pike with which he was to make a hole in the ceiling of his cell, climb out through it, and then pierce the wall separating us. He would then go directly over my cell, make a hole in the ceiling, and help me to escape through it. When we reach that point, I wrote, your task will be finished, and mine will begin. I will lead you and Count Ascino to freedom. He replied that after he had pulled me out of my cell, we would still be in prison because the attic was closed off by 3 locked doors. I know that, Reverend Father, I wrote, but we will not escape through the doors. My plan is already formed, and I am sure of its success. I ask you only to carry out my instructions exactly and not to make any objections. All you need to do is think of a way I can get my pike to you. Meanwhile, ask the jailer to buy some pictures of saints for you, enough to cover all the surfaces of your cell. They will serve to conceal the hole you will make in the ceiling. In case you are wondering why I cannot do the same, let me tell you that Lorenzo suspects me. In case you are wondering why I cannot do the same, let me tell you that Lorenzo suspects me. Although I had told him to think of the best means of sending my pike to him, I constantly thought of it myself, and I finally had a good idea, which I quickly put into action. I told Lorenzo to buy me a copy of the folio edition of the Bible, which had recently appeared. I hoped to be able to place my pike in the spine of this huge tome, but when I received it, I saw that my instrument was 2 inches too long. I nevertheless decided to send it under the protection of the Bible by using an accessory means to prevent the bearer from seeing it. Here is what I did. I told Lorenzo I wanted to celebrate St. Michael's Day with a dish of macaroni and cheese, that I also wanted to send a large platter of it to the person who had been kind enough to lend me his books, and that I wanted to prepare it myself. Then he told me the other prisoner wanted to read the big book I had bought for 3 sequins. This had been arranged beforehand. All right, I said. I'll send it to him with the macaroni. Bring me the largest platter you have in your house because I like to do things in a big way. He promised to do as I asked. I wrapped my pike in a piece of paper and placed it in the spine of the Bible, making sure that it protruded an equal distance from both ends. By placing the Bible beneath a large platter of macaroni thickly covered with melted butter, I was sure I would prevent Lorenzo from seeing the ends of the pike, because he would have his eyes fixed on the edges of the platter in order to avoid spilling grease on the book. I informed Balbi of everything and told him to make sure he took the book and the platter together, not one after the other. On the morning of St. Michael's Day, Lorenzo came earlier than usual with a pot full of hot macaroni and all the ingredients necessary to season it. I melted a quantity of butter, put the macaroni on the platter, and then poured butter over it until the platter was full to the brim. The platter was much larger than the book on which I placed it. All this was done in my cell while Lorenzo was standing outside. When everything was ready, I carefully picked up the Bible and the platter and told Lorenzo to put out his hand. As I gave him this important burden, I kept my eyes fixed on his, and I saw with great pleasure that he did not look away from the melted butter, which he was afraid he might spill on the book. He told me it would be better to take the platter first and then return for the book. But I told him he would lessen the effect of my presence if he did not deliver them together. He then complained that I had put in too much melted butter and told me that if he spilled some of it, he would not be responsible for the damage. As soon as I saw the Bible in his hands, I felt certain of success because it was impossible for him to see the ends of the pike unless he moved his head far to one side. And I saw no reason for him to take his off the platter, which he had to hold parallel with the floor. I watched him until I saw him enter the cell of the monk, who blew his nose 3 times as a signal that the delivery had been successfully made. Lorenzo came back a moment later and confirmed this himself. Balbi set to work immediately, and within a week he had made a sufficient opening in the ceiling, concealing it with a picture held in place with wads of moist bread. On October 8th, he wrote to me that he had worked all night on the wall separating us, and that he had been able to remove only 1 brick. He exaggerated the difficulty of his work, but he promised to go on with it, while at the same time telling me we would succeed in doing nothing more than making our situation worse than ever. I replied that I was sure of the contrary and urged him to persevere. Alas, I was actually sure of nothing at all. But I had either to act as though I were sure of everything or abandon my whole plan. All I knew was that I wanted to get out of the hell in which I was being kept, and I thought of nothing except taking a step forward and then going on as far as possibly could. All I knew was that I wanted to get out of the hell in which I was being kept. I thought of nothing except taking a step forward and then going on as far as I possibly could. I had learned from experience that one must not question great enterprises, but only carry them out without disputing the control which chance has over all human activities. If I had communicated these exalted mysteries of philosophy to Balbi, he would have said I was mad. His work was not difficult after the first night. And he finally found that he had removed 36 bricks. On October 16th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, I heard 3 short taps above my head. This was the signal we had arranged. He worked until evening, and the next day he wrote me that if my ceiling was composed of only 2 layers of planks, his work would be finished that same day. He assured me he would make a circular hole in accordance with my instructions, and that he would not dig all the way through the ceiling. This was especially important because the appearance of the slightest crack would have betrayed us. I'll make the excavation so that it will take only a quarter of an hour to finish it, he wrote. I told him we would make our escape the following night. I was sure that the two of us would be able to make a hole in the roof of the palace within 3 or 4 hours, climb through it, and then descend to the ground by whatever means chance might provide. When the appointed time arrived, Balbi broke through the ceiling in 3 minutes and fell into my arms. "Your work is finished," I said, "and now mine begins." We embraced each other, and he gave me back my pike. I then told him to stay in my cell while I went out to reconnoiter. 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 I found the hole rather narrow, but I managed to get through it. I entered the other cell and warmly embraced Count Ascino. I saw a man of an age and corpulence that would make it extremely difficult for him to escape along a steeply sloping roof covered with sheets of lead. He asked me what my plans were and told me he thought I had acted rather rashly. "I ask only to go forward until I find either freedom or death," I said. "If you're thinking of making a hole in the roof and then climbing down from there, I don't see how you can succeed unless you have wings. And I don't have the courage to go with you. I'll stay here and pray for you." I left his cell to examine the ceiling of the palace. I was able to touch it at the outermost edge of the attic. Testing the planks with my pike, I was overjoyed to find that they were half rotten. Seeing that I would be able to make an adequate hole in less than an hour, I went back to my cell and spent 4 hours transforming my sheets, blankets, and mattresses into rope. When this was done, I made a bundle of clothes. I told Balbi to go to his cell and pack some clothes for himself while I made a hole in the roof. I easily pulverized the rotten planks with my pike, and the opening was twice as large as necessary. As for the sheet of lead on the other side, I could not raise it alone. I summoned Balbi, and the two of us were able to bend it back sufficiently to allow us to pass through the hole. I then told him to go back to Count Ascino and ask him to lend me 30 sequins. He returned a few minutes later and told me the Count wanted to speak to me alone. The old man told me I did not need money to escape, that he had a large family, that if I perished in my attempt, his money would be lost, and a number of other ridiculous reasons designated to conceal his avarice and his reluctance to part with his money. I pleaded with him for half an hour, but in vain. I would have been justified in taking the money from him by force, but I was not cruel enough to use violence against a wretched old man. He finally asked me if 2 sequins would be enough for me. I replied that anything would be helpful. He gave me the money and asked me to give it back to him if, after examining the roof, I should decide that it would be best for me to return to my cell. I gave him my promise, surprised that he should think me capable of deciding to turn back. He did not know me. I was determined to die rather than return to a prison where I would have remained for the rest of my life. I hung half of our supply of rope over one of Balbi's shoulders and his bundle of clothes over the other. I equipped myself in the same way and climbed out through the hole in the roof. Balbi followed me. I inserted my pike in the crack between two plates of lead and pried up the edge of one of them, gripping the upturned edge. I was able to make my way to the top of the roof. Balbi gripped my belt in order to follow me. I thus found myself in the painful situation of an animal which is forced to carry and pull at the same time. And this on a steep roof made slippery by fog. Halfway up this perilous ascent, Balbi told me to stop because he had dropped one of his bundles. He hoped it had not gone past the rain gutter. I asked him if it was the bundle of rope. He replied that it was his bundle of personal effects, including a manuscript which he had found in the attic of the Leeds and from which he expected to make his fortune. I told him he would have to be patient because a step backward might cost us our lives. The poor monk sighed, and we continued to climb. After crossing 14 or 15 sheets of lead with extreme difficulty, we reached the top of the roof, which we straddled comfortably. We had our backs to the little island of San Giorgio Maggiore, and 200 yards in front of us were the numerous cupolas of San Marco, which is actually part of the ducal palace. I detached my burdens and told Balbi to imitate my example. After putting his bundle of rope on his lap, he reached up to take off his hat, but awkwardly dropped it, and it rolled down the roof to join his bundle in the canal below. "That's a bad sign," he said. "First I lost my clothes and a valuable manuscript, and now I've lost my hat." I calmly told him there was nothing about the two accidents which could cause a superstitious mind to interpret them as bad omens, and that I was far from being discouraged by them. "You ought to interpret them as a warning to be careful," I said, "and as a reminder that God is watching over us, because we would have been lost if your hat had fallen to the left instead of to the right. It would have dropped into the courtyard of the palace, where the guards would have found it and known there was someone on the roof." After looking around for several minutes, I began to walk along the top of the roof, telling Balbi to stay where he was until I returned. I searched for nearly an hour without being able to find anything near the edge of the roof to which I could attach one end of my rope. I was in terrible perplexity. I had to abandon all thought of descending into either the canal or the courtyard, and among the cupolas of the church, I could see nothing except precipices which ended in nothing open. In order to go beyond the church toward the canonica, I would have had to climb up slopes so steep that I saw no possibility of reaching the top of them. I looked at the dormer, Dormer, window 2/3 of the way down the sloping roof on the side facing the canal. It was far enough away from my starting point for me to judge that the attic into which it opened was not part of the prison. It could open only into some attic, inhabited or not, above some apartment of the palace whose doors would naturally be unlocked in the morning. I was certain that the palace servants, even those of the Doge's family, would help us escape if they saw us, because everyone hated the tribunal. With this in mind, I decided to examine the dormer window. I slid down to it and straddled its little roof. Gripping the edge, I leaned forward until I could see and touch a small grill behind which there was a window composed of panes of glass held in place by thin strips of lead. Lying on my stomach, with my head bent down in front of the grill, I thrust my pike between one of its edges and the window frame. Within a quarter of an hour, I had worked the entire grill loose and held it intact in my hands. Then I broke it in all the window panes. I then broke in all the window panes. Within a quarter of an hour, I had worked the entire grill loose and held it intact in my hands. I then broke in all the window panes. I climbed back up to the top of the roof with the aid of my pike and returned to where I had left Balbi. I found him desperate and furious. He savagely berated me for having left him alone for so long. "What did you think I was doing?" I asked. "I thought you must have fallen off the roof." "And you expressed your joy at seeing me again by insulting me. What were you doing all that time? Come with me and you'll see." I attached my bundles again and went back toward the dormer window. When we were directly above it, I told Balbi exactly what I had done and consulted him about the best way to go down into the attic through the window. It would be easier for one of us because the other could lower him with the rope, but I could not see how the second man would be able to come down, since there was no way of attaching the rope to the window. If I simply let myself drop, I might break an arm or a leg, for I did not know the distance from the window to the floor. When I expressed this reasoning in a friendly tone, my brutal companion said, "Lower me first, and then when I'm inside, you'll have plenty of time to think of a way to come down after me." I was so indignant that my first impulse was to plunge my pike into his chest. But my guardian angel made me restrain myself, and I did not utter a word of reproach about his base selfishness. On the contrary, I loosened my bundle of rope, tied it firmly under his armpits, told him to lie on his stomach, and lowered him to the roof of the dormer window. I then told him to enter the window as far as his hips, supporting himself on the edges with his arms. When this was done, I slid down as I had done the first time, lay down on the roof of the window, gripped the rope tightly, and told Balbi to let go without fear. When he reached the floor of the attic, he untied the rope. When I pulled it back, I found that there was a drop of over 50 feet. This was too high a risk, a jump. Not knowing what else to do, I waited for an inspiration. Noticing a spot near a cupola, which I had not yet examined, I went over to it, and I found a platform joined to a large dormer window closed by two shutters. On it, I saw a vat of liquid plaster and a trowel, and lying beside it was a ladder which I judged to be long enough to enable me to descend into the attic. I tied my rope to the first rung and dragged it over to the dormer window. I now had to insert the heavy, cumbersome mass into the window, and the difficulty I encountered made me regret having deprived myself of Balbi's help. I could have placed the ladder across the opening, tied my rope to it, and lowered myself without danger, but then the ladder would have remained in the same place, and the next morning it would have been betraying. The next morning it would have betrayed the place where we might still be hiding. I finally managed to slide it through the window, and Balbi held the bottom end. I threw down my clothes and the rope and descended the ladder into the attic. Arm in arm, Balbi and I now inspected the dark room in which we found ourselves. It was about 30 paces long and 20 wide. Arm in arm, Balbi and I now inspected the dark room in which we found ourselves. It was about 30 paces long and 20 wide. At the end of it, we found an unlocked door. We opened it, entered the next room, and bumped against a large table surrounded by stools and chairs. I did not recognize the place, and I wanted to know where I was. We returned to the room in which we had left our bundles. Exhausted beyond all description, I sank to the floor, placed a bundle of rope under my head, and fell asleep. I would not have been able to stay awake if I had known that death would result from my sleep, and I remember clearly the sweet pleasure I felt as I abandoned myself to it. I slept for 3.5 hours, and then I was painfully awakened by the monk's shouts and violent shaking. He told me it was 5 o'clock in the morning and that he did not understand how I could sleep in such a situation. It was not incomprehensible to me. However, my sleep had not been voluntary. I had simply yielded to nature. There was nothing surprising about my exhaustion. For 2 days, my agitation had prevented me from eating anything or closing my eyes for a single moment. Any efforts I had just made would have been enough to exhaust the strength of any man. But my sleep had restored my vigor, and I was glad to see that the darkness had diminished enough to enable us to act with more assurance and speed. I looked around and exclaimed, "This place isn't a prison, so there must be some easy way to get out of it." We went to the far end of the room where, in a narrow recess, I found a door. We went to the far end of the room where, in a narrow recess, I found a door. I groped over it until I found a keyhole. I forced my pike into it and succeeded in opening the door. We entered a small room in which I found a key on a table. I tried it on the door at the other end of the room and found that it was already unlocked. I told Balbi to go back for our bundles. I put the key back on the table where I had found it, and we walked into a gallery lined with pigeonholes full of papers. We were in the archives. I discovered a flight of stone steps. We descended them and found another staircase, at the bottom of which was a glazed door. I opened it and entered a room which I recognized. We were in the ducal chancery. I went to the door and inserted my pike in the lock, but I soon became convinced that it would be impossible for me to break it. I decided to make a hole in the door. I chose the side on which the wood had the fewest knots and quickly set to work with my pike. The monk trembled at the loud noise it made each time I drove it into the wood. I was fully aware of the danger, but I had to be brave. Within half an hour, the hole was large enough, and this was fortunate because it would have been difficult to make it any larger without the help of a saw. The edges of the hole were frightening. They bristled with points capable of tearing clothes and lacerating flesh. It was 5 feet above the floor. We placed 2 stools in front of it and climbed up on them. The monk put his head through the hole, and, holding him by the legs, I pushed him through. When he was on the other side of the door, I threw him our clothes, leaving the rope behind. I placed a 3rd stool on top of the other 2, climbed up on it, and put my body through the hole as far as the bottom of my stomach. This was very difficult because the hole was narrow. There was nothing on which I could support myself with my hands, and I had no one to push me from behind, as I had pushed Balbi. I told him to take hold of me and pull without stopping, even if he had to pull me out in pieces. He obeyed, and I had enough determination to endure the terrible pain I felt as the points gashed my hips and legs. As soon as I was on the other side, I picked up my bundle of clothes, went down 2 flights of stairs, and opened without difficulty the door leading into the corridor in which the great door of the royal staircase is located. This massive door was locked, and I saw at a glance that it would be impossible for me to open it. The pike in my hand seemed to say, "You have no more need of me. You can put me down now." But it was the instrument of my freedom, and I cherished it. Calm and resigned, I sat down and told the monk to do likewise. "My work is finished," I said. "Now it's up to God or chance to do the rest. Today is All Saints' Day, so I don't know if the palace sweepers will come in here. If someone comes in, I'll run out as soon as the door is opened, and you'll follow me. But if no one comes, I'm not going to budge from this spot, even if I starve to death." On hearing this, the poor monk flew into a rage. He called me a madman, a cheat, and a liar. I remained impassive. Meanwhile, the clock struck 6 o'clock. It had been only an hour since I woke up in the attic. Balbi looked like a peasant with his clothes intact. As for me, I could inspire only pity and horror. My clothes were ripped to shreds and soaked with blood. I tore up some handkerchiefs and bandaged myself as best I could. I put on my good suit, white stockings, and 3 shirts, one on top of the other. I then filled my pockets with extra stockings and handkerchiefs and threw the rest of my belongings into a corner. My appearance was such that I could have been taken for a man who had gone to a ball and then spent the night in a brothel. I put on my lace trimmed hat with its white feather and opened a window. My face was immediately noticed by some idlers in the palace courtyard. Not understanding why a man dressed as I was should be at that window at such an early hour, they went off to tell the concierge. Apparently believing that he must have locked someone inside the night before, he took his keys and came to open the door. I was sorry I had let myself be seen at the window, not knowing that chance was serving me as well as I could ask. I put my eye to a crack between two planks of the door and saw a man coming up the staircase alone with a large bunch of keys in his hand. I told Balbi to stand quietly behind me and then follow me. I took my pike in my hand, my right hand, hid it under my coat, and placed myself in a position to dash out the door as soon as it was opened. I prayed that the man would make no resistance, because in that case I would be forced to fell him. And I was determined to do so if necessary. The door opened, and the poor man was petrified at the sight of me. Without saying a word, taking advantage of his stupefaction, I ran down the staircase and Balbi followed me. I ignored his cries of, "Into the church," and went on my way. The door to the church was only 20 paces from the staircase, but in Venice the churches had ceased to give sanctuary to criminals, and no one took refuge in them. Balbi knew this, but fear had taken away his memory. The sanctuary I sought was beyond the borders of the Republic. I was already there in spirit, and now I had to arrive there in body. I went straight to the royal door of the ducal palace and crossed the small square in front of it without looking at anyone, a good way to be less carefully observed by others. I went over to the canal and stepped into the first gondola I found, saying loudly to the gondolier who was in the stern, "I want to go to Fusina. Call another oarsman." While the gondola was being untied from the bank, I threw myself on the cushion in the center, and Balbi sat down on the bench. As soon as we had passed the custom house, the gondoliers began to row vigorously along the Giudecca Canal, which one must follow in order to go either to Fusina or Mestre, which was where I actually wanted to go. When we were in the middle of the canal, I put my head outside and said to the gondolier in the stern, "Do you think we'll be in Mestre within 4 hours? But you said you wanted to go to Fusina." "You must be mad. I said Mestre." The second gondolier told me I was mistaken, and my stupid monk, a zealous Christian and a great friend of the truth, did not fail to repeat that I was wrong. I had a strong impulse to kick him, to punish him for his stupidity, but instead I laughed and agreed that I might have been a mistake. I might have made a mistake, adding that my true intention was nonetheless to go to Mestre. The gondolier replied that he was willing to take me all the way to England if I wanted him to. I looked at the canal behind me. It seemed more beautiful than I had ever seen it before, especially since there was not a single boat in sight behind us. It was a superb morning. The air was clear. The first rays of sun were magnificent, and my two young gondoliers were rowing with ease and vigor. I thought of the cruel night I had just spent, of all the dangers I had just escaped, of the cell in which I had been imprisoned the day before, of all the ways in which chance had been favorable to me, and of the freedom I was beginning to enjoy. I was so deeply moved by all of this that, full of gratitude to God, I burst into tears. My charming companion, who, until then, had not uttered a word except to say that the gondoliers were right and I was wrong, now took it upon himself to console me, mistaken about the cause of my tears. As I have said before, the poor monk was stupid, and his maliciousness came only from his stupidity. We arrived in Mestre, where a coachman agreed to take us. We arrived in Mestre, where a coachman agreed to take us to Treviso in an hour and a quarter. 3 minutes later, the horses were ready. Assuming Balbi to be behind me, I turned around to tell him to get into the carriage, but he was not there. I was furious. I should have abandoned him, but a feeling of humanity kept me from doing so. I made inquiries. Everyone had seen him, but no one could tell me where he was or where he might be. I hurried along the arcades of the main street until, instinctively looking in through the window of a cafe, I saw the scoundrel standing at the counter drinking a cup of hot chocolate and flirting with the waitress. When he saw me, he pointed to the waitress, told me she was charming, invited me to have a cup of chocolate, and asked me to pay for his, since he had no money. Repressing my indignation, I said to him, "I don't want any, and hurry up." At the same time, I pinched his arm so hard that he turned pale with pain. I paid, and we left the cafe. I was trembling with anger. We returned to the carriage and climbed in, but before we had gone 10 yards, I saw a citizen of Mestre named Balbi Tomasi, who had been, or rather, who had had the reputation of being a hireling of the tribunal. He knew me. He came up to the carriage and called out, "What? You here? I'm glad to see you. You must have just escaped. How'd you do it?" "I didn't escape. I was released." "That's impossible, because I was in Signor Grimani's house last night, and I would have heard about it." Reader, it will be easier for you to imagine my feelings at that moment than for me to describe them to you. I saw myself discovered by a man whom I believed to be paid to arrest me. He would have had only to signal to the first Spiro he saw, and Mestre was full of them. I told him to speak more softly, climbed out of the carriage, and asked him to come with me to a place where we could speak in private. I led him behind a house where we could be seen by no one. We were beside a ditch, on the other side of which was a level field. I took my pike in one hand and grabbed his collar with the other. Seeing my intention, he struggled, freed himself, leapt over the ditch, and began to run as fast as he could. When he had covered a certain distance, he turned his head and threw kisses to me as a sign that he wished me a safe voyage. When he was out of sight, I thanked God that his agility had saved me from committing a murder, for he apparently had no bad intentions. I came back to the cowardly monk, who was aware of the danger to which he had just exposed us. I cast a scornful glance at him and climbed back into the carriage. He did not dare to open his mouth until we reached Treviso, where I ordered a carriage and 2 horses for 10 o'clock. But I did not actually intend to go on traveling by coach. First of all, because I did not have the money for it, and also because I was afraid of being followed. The innkeeper asked me if I wanted breakfast. I was starving, but I did not dare to accept. A wasted quarter of an hour might have been fatal. I went out through the city gate as though I were simply taking a stroll, and after walking along the highway for a mile, I turned into the fields with the intention of not leaving them until I was outside the territory of the Venetian Republic. The shortest way was through Bassano, but I took the longest way because it was not impossible that the Sabri were waiting for me at the nearest border town. After walking for 7 hours, I stopped beside a hamlet 24 miles from Treviso. I was exhausted, my ankles were swollen, and my shoes were worn through. I lay down in the middle of a clump of trees. I told Balbi to sit down beside me and said to him, "We must go to Borgo di Valsugano. It's the first town on the other side of the border. There will be as safe as if we were in London, and we'll be able to rest. But in order to get there, we'll have to take precautions. And the most important one is to separate from each other. You'll go through the Mantello woods, and I'll go across the mountains. I'll give you my cloak. You can trade it for an overcoat and a hat, and everyone will take you for a peasant. Here's all the money I have left from the 2 sequins Count Asquino gave me. 17 lire. Lire. You'll be in Borgo day after tomorrow, and I'll arrive 24 hours later. Wait for me in the last inn on the left. For tonight, I need to sleep in a good bed, and Providence will help me find one somewhere. But I need to have my mind at ease, and with you that would be impossible. I'm sure they're looking all over the Republic for us now, and our descriptions have probably been circulated. So we'd be arrested if we went to an inn together. You can see the sad state I'm in and how necessary it is for me to have at least 10 hours rest. So leave me now and let me go my way alone. I was expecting everything you just said, replied Balbi. My only answer will be to remind you of what you promised me when I let you persuade me to break into your cell. You promised me we wouldn't separate, so don't think I'm going to leave you now. We'll find a good bed for our money without going to an inn, and we won't be arrested. So you're determined not to follow my advice? Yes. We'll see. I took out my pike and calmly began to dig, giving no reply to the questions he asked me. After working for a quarter of an hour, I looked at him sadly and told him that, as a good Christian, I was obliged to inform him that he must commend his soul to God. I'm going to bury you here, dead or alive, I said. Or, if you're stronger than I am, you'll have to bury me. Your stubbornness leaves me no choice, but you can still run away if you like, because I won't run after you. Seeing that he did not answer me, I went back to work. I began to fear that he might force my hand, and I was determined to get rid of him. Finally, whether from fear or reflection, he said to me, I'll do what you want me to do. I immediately embraced him, gave him all the money I had, and repeated my promise to rejoin him in Borgo. Although I was now penniless and obliged to cross 2 rivers, I was glad to be rid of the company of a man of his character, because now that I was alone, I was sure I would be able to cross the border of my dear republic